Joumana Kayrouz. You've seen her images on giant billboards across the metro. Joumana Kayrouz. You've seen her images on buses across the city. Now get to know Joumana Kayrouz.
The war broke out in my home country, Lebanon. I was 11 years old, and I saw a lot of bloodshed and inequality and poverty. You can't grow up in an environment like that and not be affected by it and not want to make a difference. I graduated from Yale University with a master's in ethics. I speak 4 languages. It has always been innate in me fighting for the underdog and trying to do whatever it is I can to make a difference in the world.
Let Joumana Kayrouz protect your rights. Call the law offices of Joumana Kayrouz at 1-866-YOUR-RIGHTS extension 100 or visit yourrights.com.
قد يحاول بعض المصابين في حوادث السيارات إدارة قضاياهم توفيرا لأتعاب المحامين، والآن مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز بإمكانه المساعدة من خلال إشرافه على سير القضية في جزئها الأول المتعلق بتعويضات الراتب والخدمات المنزلية، وتقوم بإرشادك في كيفية إدارة ملفك مجانا، بينما سيتولى المكتب مهمة الدفاع عن قضيتك في جزئها الثاني المتعلق برفع دعوى عن عطل وضرر. للمزيد من المعلومات اتصلوا بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز والاستشارات مجانية 248-557-3645. برنامج يور رايتس مع المحامية جومانا كيروز المختصة في قضايا حوادث السيارات، مع نخبة من المحامين في اختصاصات عدة منها الطلاق والهجرة والإفلاس، يأتيكم الآن على الهواء مباشرة. أسعد الله أوقاتكم بالخير مستمعينا في كل مكان، تحية طيبة لكم وحلقة جديدة من برنامج يور رايتس تأتيكم على الهواء مباشرة مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. أرقام الهواتف في الاستوديو للمشاركة معنا هي 313-769-6666 519-256-1023. ودائما نذكركم بأن مكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز تقوم بتقديم الاستشارات المجانية في القضايا التي يتعامل معها المكتب، وهي قضايا الإصابات الشخصية من ضمنها حوادث السيارات، إصابات العمل، الأخطاء الطبية، قضايا الهجرة والتجنس، قضايا الإفلاس، الضمان الاجتماعي، وقوانين العائلة. 248-557-3645. أيضا ننوه أن حلقات برنامج يور رايتس جميعها على اليوتيوب، وسيتم رفع هذه الحلقة، حلقة اليوم، في غضون 24 ساعة سيكون بإمكانكم الاستماع إليها مرة أخرى عبر زيارة قناة جومانا كيروز على اليوتيوب. ودائما نحييكم أحباء المستمعين ونرحب بك جومانا في برنامج يور رايتس. أهلا وسهلا.
أهلا وسهلا فيك. مساء الخير لك ولكل المستمعين.
مساء النور.
مرة نستقبل ضيفنا محامي جاي ياسو، اللي هو خبير ومحامي في قضايا الإصابات الشخصية وبالتحديد بقضايا الأخطاء الطبية.
نعم.
بسبب بالإنجليزي medical malpractice. رح نرحب فيه بعد دقيقة إذا بتسمح لي.
نعم.
ببداية البرنامج شكرا يلي عم يتصلوا واللي عم بيقدموا على الجوب بوستينجز اللي مكتب. عبينا 1 position من أصل 4. بعد نبش على 3 موظفين إضافيين. ليلي بيحب يتصل على مكتبنا 248-557-3645. كمان مرة 248-557-3645. عم ننبش على صبايا أو شباب بيشتغلوا فول تايم حتى لو ما عندهم خبرة سابقة. إذا عندهم بعض الأشياء الأخرى اللي نحن بنقدر نحددها عبر الانترفيو، وطالما بيحكوا الإنجليزي بتقانة وبيحكوا العربية بيقدروا يقدموا على المكتب. No prior experience needed. We are willing to train them. كمان مرة ليلي بيهموا الأمر عم نبش على 3 موظفين أو موظفات اللي هدول 3 job postings. وثانك يو رامي إنه بتعطينا مجال إنه
بالعكس.
نعمل announcements. Thank you very much.
فأكيد الأشخاص اللي حابين يعرفوا تفاصيل أكثر عن هذه الوظائف ومعلومات أكثر بإمكانهم الاتصال مرة أخرى بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز 248-557-3645.
وكمان منردد رمضان مبارك للجميع. قررنا هالسنة كل يوم رح نقول رمضان مبارك. بنستقبل ضيفنا لليوم المحامي جاي ياسو اللي بينضم إلنا مرة بالشهر، وهو بيشتغل مع مكتبنا مش بقلب مكتبنا. هو ممبر وبارتنر باللو فيرم العريقة جدا اللي عمرها فوق ال 75 سنة، سومرز اند شوارتز، اختصاصيين بعدة أمور، وحدة منهم الميديكال malpractice أو الأخطاء الطبية. Jay Yasso, good afternoon. Very happy to have you again. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great, Joumana. It's very nice to be with you again. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you for joining us once a month. Thank you for educating us on medical malpractice. We have at least a couple of scenarios today that we want to talk about that are very, very interesting. One of them goes to the fact that ordinary, and I mean by ordinary, lay people, people who don't have medical training, people who don't have medical knowledge, people who don't have nursing training, should be able sometimes when they see their loved ones or as it pertains to them, should be able to ask questions of the doctors, of the hospital, of the medical treaters. When things don't look right, when things don't sound right, maybe they're really not right. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about an example of such a case. Another one, another example we'd like to talk about today brings home the following point that medical malpractice can happen to anyone. Anyone can be the victim of a medical mistake. You can be, a very, very prominent person, and you can be someone way less prominent, at least by society standards, and you may be the victim of medical malpractice. We are going to talk about a very high wage earning prominent person in the legal community who sadly passed at one of what we believe to be one of the biggest, one of the most respected hospitals here in Michigan, to drive the point that anyone can be the victim of a medical mistake. And we will also use that example as a chance to explain again to people how we analyze cases. When you get a case and you have to decide not only whether or not a medical mistake happened, but are there enough damages there? Are the damages high enough to justify the tens and tens of thousands of dollars that is going to cost you to work up the file? So those are the two things we wish to talk about today. And God willing, Rami, we will run the show again, not this Sunday at 7 p.m., but next Sunday at 7 p.m. so that people can from the information. Thank you very much. So the first point we're talking about is that we should be able, whether we as a patient or we as the loved ones of a patient or the loved ones of a friend, when we see things that are happening in the medical arena, when we accompany somebody to a medical appointment, or when we are at the hospital with a loved one or a friend, and things don't look quite right, we have the right, and we should listen to our intuition, because it may be onto something very truthful, and we should be able to ask questions and question what we see. Can you tell us about the patient who we're talking about here, or rather the now deceased dead client that you are representing and that you are near negotiating a settlement on with that hospital?
Thank you, Joumana, again for having me. A lot of doctors are friends of mine, but I always like to say that in the medical community, there's what they call a white wall, just like in the police force, you have the blue wall, where when something goes wrong, you kind of all cover for each other and try to protect each other. Not to say that there's anything unlawful that you might do, but there's a certain level of protection that you give to somebody that you work with. Well,
Yes.
that's what I think happens within the hospital settings, quite frankly. And as you're just indicating, as patients, we really don't know what goes on the inside. I'm going to just change a little bit and talk a little bit about something that just happened with respect to the George Floyd matter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows what happened, but we only know about what happened because there was a video that showed us what happened. Imagine for a second, Joumana, that if there was no video in the George Floyd matter, all you had was the version of the police report created by the police officers that led to his death. You
Yes.
know quite well there's not going to be an indication of somebody resting their knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds in that report. You know that. So a
Yeah.
video was sort of the eyes and ears for the world to see really what happened here. And if it wasn't for that video, who knows whether or not Chauvin would have ever been convicted in this case. Well,
Yes.
when we talk about the medical field, it's sort of the same thing. We really don't know a lot about what happens unless there's somebody on the inside or somebody that knows what happened, like in my
Or
case.
somebody, like in your case, saw what happened.
Exactly. And then what, just without going into too much details for confidentiality purposes, essentially, you know, there was information at this particular hospital where a patient was overdosed by a nurse. It
By
was
a
in a,
nurse. He did
I'm
not
sorry.
overdose. The nurse overdosed him.
Correct. Correct. So the nurse was agitated with the patient, and he was on a regular floor. He was on the road to recovery. And so she gave him medications that put him over, caused him to arrest, become unconscious.
So let me just clarify for our listeners. We're not saying that she intentionally meant to overdose him.
Right.
We're not saying she was helping him overdose. Not at all. This was a patient. I'm sorry to take over, but let me just clarify.
Yeah,
This was
no.
a patient who suffered multiple gunshot wounds and was admitted to ICU. He stayed in the ICU for 2.5 weeks, where he had multiple surgeries. At some point, he did so much better that they transferred him from the intensive care unit to a regular floor. He was being agitated, and the nurse gave him something to calm him down. He stayed agitated. She got so fed up with him that she decided to give him an extra dose of that medication, thus causing him to to causing him to have a cardiac arrest and causing him to quote unquote overdose. Correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Now, you just gave a version of what happened, because the other part of that story is that you and I and nobody else probably wouldn't have known much about what happened because of that white wall, unless, of course, there was somebody inside that white wall that saw what happened. And in this case, what we have is an employee of the hospital who witnessed the nurse overdosing this patient and brought it to their attention and so forth and so on. And the whole case or the whole situation unraveled after that.
So
And,
let me interrupt for a minute. When you talk about the white wall amongst doctors, and let's talk about what white wall happened here. You ordered his medical records, and his medical records, as you put them, were very clean. He
correct.
supposedly died of natural causes, multiple wounds. There was no mention whatsoever of the fact that this patient was given doses of calmant, thus making him overdose. So if you looked only at the medical records, they were silent.
Pretty clean. There was one very subtle entry that talks about this patient being given 3 sedatives, medications that suppresses the respiratory system. And that was done like the day after he had arrested. Somebody wrote it in there. That's all the evidence, plus the witness who saw it happen. That's it. Okay.
So,
And
so the interesting thing about the witness who saw it happen, the way your firm got the case was actually through the witness who reported what she saw to her supervisor, and as a result of that was fired. And so, because she was fired, she rightly believed that that was wrongful termination. So she sought out your firm because you have an employment law division for wrongful termination. And as you were gathering the facts, it came out what she witnessed. And
right.
and yes, and then
It was through her that we learned unfortunate what happened to this patient. Again, you're not going to get the medical professionals stepping forward in these cases and admitting fault or falling on their swords. They simply don't do that. They make you get to records. They make you hire a lawyer. They make you conduct a very thorough investigation, spend a lot of money before you can get any answer. So that's that white wall. There's a certain level of protection that they give themselves, when something goes wrong, and you really have to go, through your lawyers to get that information that you deserve, and sometimes it's through witnesses and sometimes it's through documents.
Right. And we always say, we need the medical records. We need the medical records to see if any mistake has happened. And here, the medical records appear clean. Yes, there is a reference to having been given 3 doses, but by and large, they look pretty clean.
Right.
I think, like the George Floyd case, it turned out to be a slam dunk because there was a video. Nobody can dispute what was on that video. And the length of the video, and the same here. There's a witness who actually saw things as they were unfolding and reported it and got fired for it.
Right.
So I think this example, the 3 life scenario, drives the point that there is a conspiracy of silence by doctors and hospitals. And sometimes you have to keep digging. If it doesn't add up, if it doesn't look right, maybe something was not right. And secondly, you have the right as a patient or as the family of a patient to, I know when you go to doctors, they're always rushing you. It has become ridiculous. It has really become ridiculous. They're rushing you. I remember once talking to a Dr. J, who was so proud of telling me that he sees 90 patients a day. And I said to myself, I'm not impressed at all. You're turning this into a business. How much time can you see a patient? If you see 90 patients a day, I definitely do not want you as my doctor. I want to go to a doctor who will answer my questions, who will explain things to me. I was very, very unimpressed, but I think everybody who's listening will relate that we're getting rushed. They bill our insurance companies high rates, so they get paid well. But then they don't give us the time that we deserve. And people are getting rushed. It's almost like they're doing you a favor. Getting information out of doctors has become like pulling teeth.
Yeah, it is. It is like an assembly line. Joumana, with respect to what you were just talking about, rushing you out, clients, if they question anything, not just at the hospital, but at their doctor's offices about their care, they have a right to request medical records. I get a lot of calls from clients saying, I'm afraid to ask for my records. What if the doctor asks me, why do I need the records? And I continuously tell my clients, those records are your property. They belong to you. The doctors are merely holding on to them. You have a right for a copy of what belongs to you, so ask for it. And, I said, you have a right to them. And now, because of the electronic record system that's in place, Joumana, we get a little bit more sophisticated with respect to the requests of records that we make, because there's now this whole, what they call audit trail requests, where you can go in and get the sort of the background information about the records themselves and when they were entered into the system and who made entries into those records and at what time they made the entries into the records. The reason being is that those electronic records now can help us determine if doctors are going back there, filling in information after the fact, or if they're not filling information at all, because everything is time stamped, if you will. Right. And it really prevents a lot of issues with respect to us believing that doctors are manipulating their records.
Right. What was the true term for that? The correct term, when somebody in the medical field tries after the fact to change the records?
It's called a felony.
No, well, yes, it is a felony.
Yeah.
Temporarily, if not permanently, of your medical license. And I remember one doctor who, in a medical malpractice case, it was established that he went back to change the records.
Yeah.
They made him write to all, they suspended his medical license for 6 months, and they made him write a letter to each and every patient, notifying them that his license has been temporarily suspended.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Um, I wanted to say something, and I'm sorry, I completely forgot.
Yeah. But your point with respect to what we were just talking about, Joumana, is that as patients, we have to kind of keep our eyes and ears open, and when you just feel something is not right, something has gone south with respect to your medical condition or somebody else's, and it really wasn't supposed to go that way. Ask the questions, get the medical records, and if you need to, if something is really bad, get the lawyers involved.
Yes, and I remember what I wanted to add. We've talked about that on the radio quite a few times. If you have Medicaid and you want to obtain a copy of your medical records, you should be able to get them for free. There is a statute, there is a law here in Michigan that says that if you are on governmental assistance, you have the right to ask for and your medical records for free. And like you said, a lot of people still don't know that the medical records are your property. Yes, the doctor is required to keep them, but you are entitled to have a copy of them. So it's the exact same thing.
Right.
Let's take a very quick break, and we will return with Attorney Jay Yasso. Once a month, we have him on, and he shares his. Well, before we take a break, I apologize. I wanted to add, the hospital is interested. So after you saw that the medical records are pretty silent and pretty clean, and they put that the cause of death for this person is not the nurse overdosing him, but rather of multiple wounds and natural causes, now you have the hospital in a position where they are interested in settling.
Yeah, so that's where we get paid the big bucks. We as lawyers have to get those records, and it is really like putting a puzzle together. You have to pull out information from the records that would convince the other side that really they were at fault. And in this case, just like as in the George Floyd case, I hate making that comparison, but it really is, where in George Floyd's case, we have a video. Here we have an eyewitness, an employee of the hospital who saw everything go down, and she brought it to their attention. She saw the whole thing. She's a 9 or 10-year employee. So that information was included in my proposition to the hospital and trying to get this case resolved. And they conducted their investigation. I told them to interview the same witnesses that I interviewed, and they came to the same conclusions that we did, that he was likely overdosed.
And the implication here is that, much like with George Floyd, whose death was preventable, but for the ridiculous, animalistic, excessive force used by the police officer, here too, his death would have been preventable. I mean, he survived multiple wounds and he was put back together through multiple surgeries and did so well that he was moved to the regular floor. And but for the nurse overdosing him by giving him too much of that medication because she didn't want to deal with him, he will have survived more likely than not.
Clearly, I mean, when you look at all the medical evidence in the records, he went in again with multiple gunshot wounds, and they really worked him up. And, it was a battle. And, honestly, Joumana, if he had passed away in the ICU, I think we would probably all agree it was, from complications from multiple gunshot wounds, clearly, because he had many of them. But they did such a remarkable job on him in the ICU that they actually were able to transfer him. And in the records, they were talking about discharging him. So this was all like, he was improving. There's all indication that he was getting better. And then, of course, this event happens.
And I find it very shocking that the medical records state that he died of natural causes and multiple wounds.
So I'm gonna, and I know we have to go to a commercial, but
We
you know,
don't.
you have to.
So I just wanted to take a break so that we can switch to another topic. But
Yeah.
continue, please.
Yeah. So, kind of another part to this same story is that once he died, the family requested an autopsy. And as
Yeah.
you can imagine, when you do an autopsy, one of the things that you can do is a toxicology study where the pathologist will test all the fluids in the human body to see if what the cause of death may be. Um, Long story short, when the pathologist from another county examined the body of the deceased, they did not do a toxicology study because they did not suspect that there was any signs of overdose. I brought it to their attention after the body had already been buried. All right. And I said to them, you need to take a look at the records. I have an eyewitness. So now I had to have the pathologist do an addendum to the autopsy report indicating that there may be a question of overdose here, although no toxicology studies had been done. So at least that was made as part of the record.
Okay, so the toxicology part of an autopsy is not, I mean, how would you suspect that somebody in a hospital would quote unquote overdose?
Well, see, that's where the hospital's white wall comes into play. If they had been honest, okay, this gentleman died not too long after he was given these medication. Wouldn't you tell the pathologist, hey, by the way, his death might have been caused by these medications, do a toxicology study? Then they would have tested the blood. They would have been able to tell exactly what happened. But they didn't do that. They tested all the other parts of the body and they determined it was the natural causes.
And it will not have been possible to exhume the body and conduct that, I
Yeah,
suppose?
I've even asked that question. The problem is that, first of all, I think, I could be wrong, but I think the body was cremated.
I see. Oh,
I
well.
believe it was cremated. Yeah.
If I told you, Jay, that most people I talk to say they don't trust hospitals, they don't. They innately don't trust hospitals. Do you agree?
So I'm on both sides of the fence, if you will, on this because I've seen them do some remarkable stuff. I've always said, and I still do today, when I make a donation, it's usually to Children's Hospital of Michigan because I've got a younger sister who had some complications when she was born, and she was in Children's Hospital for the first 2 years of her life, and she's still alive today. But they did a remarkable job working with her. So there are some wonderful institutions, some great doctors, but I'm in the business of looking at those incidences or those doctors that create the bad name for the profession so that we can police it and we can make it better. And that's really where our job comes in all of this is that doctors do great work, but there are some bad ones, just like there's in the legal profession, just like there is in the engineering profession, wherever. And you've got to kind of police the industry so that you can get, in this case, better medical care. And that's what we're trying to do.
That's right, because I'm sure that hospital has learned its lesson about their nurses over medicating people or, overdosing them, because
Right.
this is going. So in doing all that, you cannot give that person his life back. You can only get financial compensation for his heirs or his, decedents. But in the process of doing that, you are
Right.
causing the hospitals to re-examine its policies and its training so that this doesn't happen again. So you're improving the system for future patients.
That's correct. That's exactly right. That's sort of what's happening in George Floyd. There's all sorts of legislation at the federal level right now to try to correct police conduct, if you will,
Right.
and work on that. And so that's all as a result of what happened here. So hopefully there's always change for the positive.
Right. Let's take a very quick break and then we're going to talk about another very sad case. And to the point that medical mistakes can happen. Anybody can be the victim of medical mistakes. You can be at the best hospitals. This is about the University of Michigan that is so highly regarded by us here in the area. We think it's the finest hospital, and I'm sure it is in many ways. We'll talk about this right after the break.
قد يحاول بعض المصابين في حوادث السيارات إدارة قضاياهم توفيرا لأتعاب المحامين، والآن مكتب المحامية جمانة كيروز بإمكانه المساعدة من خلال إشرافه على سير القضية في جزئها الأول المتعلق بتعويضات الراتب والخدمات المنزلية، وتقوم بإرشادك في كيفية إدارة ملفك مجانا، بينما سيتولى المكتب مهمة الدفاع عن قضيتك في جزئها الثاني المتعلق برفع دعوى عن عطل وضرر. للمزيد من المعلومات اتصلوا بمكتب المحامية جمانة كيروز والاستشارات مجانية 248-557-3645. مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يبحث عن موظف أو موظفة يجيد اللغتين العربية والإنجليزية بطلاقة، والخبرة غير ضرورية. الوظيفة بدوام كامل 5 أيام في الأسبوع. للراغبين بشغل هذه الوظيفة الاتصال بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز على رقم 248-557-3645 248-557-3645. Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. عودة إلى برنامج Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز، وأرقام الهواتف في الاستوديو 313-769-6666 519-256-1023 وعلى الواتساب 313-327-7074. جومانا نرجع لك مرة أخرى.
شكرا جزيلا. بنرجع هلأ لتاني example عن شخص تاني تعرض بنفتكر هي إصابة شخصية خطأ طبي، توفى بعمر 43 سنة بمستشفى من أكبر المستشفيات هون في ولاية ميشيغان، مع المحامي جياسو اللي بنلتقي فيه مرة بالشهر وبنتكلم معه لمدة ساعة عن الأخطاء الطبية. So Attorney Jayaso, the next example is about a very young lawyer here in the legal community who sadly passed away, we believe, as the result of negligence at a major medical hospital here. Can you tell us a little bit more about this case?
Yeah, because the case is really under investigation, I just want to be a little bit careful about using the proper parties or whatever. But so I'll just speak in generic terms, and I think you and the audience will understand what I'm indicating. Yeah, you and I on previous shows have talked about how it is that we come up with calculations for damages in some of our medical malpractice cases, and I just thought that this was really a good example. A relatively young professional who was at a major medical center here in the area, and because of we believe malpractice from either during surgery or immediately after surgery, he started to lose consciousness, never regained consciousness. Went into comatose state and then was in and out of comatose a number of times, and then died within 6 months. He never regained consciousness, and it's really sad, and it's one of those situations where, again, we believe, and we're still investigating it, that had the doctors been a little bit more attentive, had they just paid attention to the signs and symptoms of what was abnormal with this patient, because there were all sorts of red flags going off about what was happening, and they didn't, and he passed away. Really, that's the gist of the malpractice, is the failure to recognize complications either during or after surgery.
Right. So I understand you are still investigating. Now, he went into surgery for a treatable tumor next to his pancreas. So you did say to me that area of the body is pretty complex and complicated. There is a lot going on. So what you're looking into is whether or not there was negligence during the surgery or after the surgery. You did say that this is a low-risk surgery. This is a low-risk surgery. It's a very treatable thing. So one would expect a young person like him at 43 to come out of it. But sadly, he ended up being the one to go into coma for 6 months. I believe he was in ICU for 6 months and then passed away.
Correct. Yes.
And the reason you suspect, you're making it clear that you are still investigating, but the reason you suspect that there may have been negligence Now you're looking to see if there was negligence, either during the surgery or post-operatively,
Right.
is because this is the kind of surgery that is by definition very low risk
Right.
and very treatable. So the logical mind would expect a totally different outcome than death. Based on that, you're saying it isn't adding up. This is not a high risk surgery. This is not brain surgery.
Right.
This is pancreas surgery, and it should not have been. We should not have encountered that kind of outcome. So from here, you're saying we need to look into this. We need to see what what could have gone wrong, and whether it would have been the kind of thing that could have been avoided or detected early and reversed, fixed, etc.
Exactly. So, and I know in the past we've talked about, since you're dealing with medicine and you're entering the human body, there's all kinds of risks. And we understand it as lawyers that represent patients that there are risks that are inherent in any surgical procedure. Okay. And that could be the risk of bleeding, the risk of an infection developing, the risk of scar tissue, whatever it may be, that those things can happen. And if they do, the doctors are not held accountable. It's not malpractice. Okay. The malpractice in these risk cases, like I believe in this case, if it all bears out, is that there was a failure to act upon a risk that occurred. Okay, so if there's bleeding during surgery, that's not the malpractice. The malpractice is the failure to recognize that there's a bleed and to stop the bleed. And if you
Sure.
don't do that, then there's malpractice. Okay,
Sure.
so here what occurred was, again, you're dealing with a lot of arteries and veins and so forth in the midsection near the pancreas, and there's a lot of fluid that is being exchanged through the arteries. And there was, according to the records, right after surgery, tests were done, which appeared to show that there was blockages to some of the major organs, the liver and the kidneys. And the doctors really didn't pay attention to those abnormal signs. They should have, and didn't take them back to surgery and open them up like they should have, and they didn't. And they sat on them for about 12 hours or so until they took them back in. By that time, it was too late. Too late in the sense that the blood supply to those organs had already been cut off, and those organs had already started to die.
Um, he happened to be a prominent lawyer here in the area. And although he was highly educated, some of his family was in the medical field, some of his family was in the legal field. So he's a prominent, highly educated individual.
Mhm.
And yet, um, he was what we believe to be the victim of medical malpractice. In other words, you can be the victim of a medical mistake even if you are very prominent.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't discriminate. You could be anybody. Gosh, I was thinking of this a little bit earlier. There's been a number of city officials from the city of Detroit. I remember one city councilwoman who went in for a gastric bypass procedure, I believe, up in the Port Huron area, and suffered some complications and died. Either during surgery or immediately thereafter. Yeah, so you could be anybody, and it doesn't take much. And again, you hope and pray that when you go in for surgery, that the doctors will just pay the necessary attention, uh, and the staff around them as well, because the doctors aren't always there to make sure that if there are any complications, if there's any bells and whistles, or if any red flags going up with your care, that somebody looks at it and figures it out and then treats you.
This,
That's what you
exa-
hope for.
this example also shows that it can happen in major medical centers, major teaching hospitals,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, and I tell my clients all the time, we really have sued from north to south, from east to west, all the major medical centers in the state of Michigan. And we do have a lot of work coming in from out of state. So we've been suing hospitals in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, and Ohio as well.
Mhm. Now let's talk about this case. High wage earner, lawyer, age 43, so he had a lot of years to work, big damages, death. How can we value this case? Let's assume for a minute that there was negligence and that the negligence is what caused his death. Now, how can we put a dollar value on this case?
Okay. Well, I hope I'm not giving my secrets away to the defense bar who might be listening. But basically, you have to look at all the factors that are in play here. First of all, you have to look at there are two sets of damages. You look at the non-economic or the pain and suffering damages, and then you look at the other side, the economic, or in this case, you're going to have wage loss and maybe some unpaid medical expenses and things of that nature. For the non-economic or the pain and suffering side, again, those are capped under Michigan law. And we believe, I'm sorry.
There is a maximum dollar
Yep.
amount under Michigan law.
Correct. And when we're negotiating these cases, we have to look at these caps. The juries in a trial never gets to hear about the caps. Those are issues that are discussed after the jury comes back. To give you an example, if a jury comes back for $10 million and the case is worth the low cap amount, the day after trial, the defense attorney files a motion and says to the judge, Judge, we have a cap of $475,000. The judge will reduce the $10 million to $475,000. Okay. That's what you have here in Michigan.
Likewise, if the jury comes back with a $36 million verdict and it's the higher cap, that being $851,000, that $15 or $20 million case, the jury does not know that. The judge will reduce that $20 million down to $851,000, which is what we believe the value of this case is for the pain and suffering.
Well, that's the artificial number that was chosen that creeps up every year. It goes up a little bit higher because there's cost of living built into it. But yeah, it was just some numbers that the legislature in Lansing selected back in 1993, and they gave us a low cap and a high cap. Back then it was 250 for the low cap, 500 for the high cap, and now they've creeped up. But the one change that I make to what you just said about the $10 million verdict, you have to keep in mind, if all of that $10 million from the jury was for pain and suffering.
Yeah, I'm assuming pain and suffering for a minute, not economic, not medical bills and all of that, yes.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
But with baby cases, when you have part of the verdict is for future medical treatment and future education and all of that, right. These are actual numbers. The judge cannot reduce those. We're talking about the pain and suffering. Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, so absolutely. So yeah, as an example, dealing with baby cases, and if you have future medical care and costs associated with that care, then and if the jury gives you a big number, and in that big number are the economic medical care for that child, those are not reduced.
Correct.
It's only the pain and suffering.
Right. Now, this attorney's pain and suffering may be capped at $851,000. However, he also has economic damages. He passed at age 43. He'd work up until what's the age that you use? You said 65, but does it have to be 65?
It doesn't have to be. And, so in these kinds of cases, we get economists, experts involved. And, not everybody retires at 65. People like to work. They might work until they're 67 or 70 or even beyond that. But there is usually a cutoff for some of this, and it's usually somewhere around 65 or 67.
Which is the age of retirement. The full age of retirement is 67.
Correct. But I want to even back up. You assumed that in this case, the higher cap was going to apply of 851, right?
Right.
And you're right. But I think your audience has to know why the lower cap doesn't apply.
So the higher cap applies when the alleged medical malpractice or the medical mistake causes brain death or renders you paraplegic, quadriplegic, or hemiplegic, or causes damage to your reproductive organs. Anything that's not that, it's the lower cap, which is 475.
Very good.
I
That is
passed.
exactly right.
Did I pass?
You did it very well. And so in our case, this gentleman was he had no brain activity for about 5 or 6 months, and so we believe that that can allow us to reach the higher cap in this case.
Correct. Except that no amount of,
No.
no dollar amount can put, can come near this injury. I mean, how can that be? $851,000. How can you say that the pain and suffering for the family of this person is not even $1 million? But the legislature did that because they were very friendly back in 1993 to hospitals and doctors. So they did that. They made things harder, and they have increasingly made things harder in the field of medical malpractice because they are pro big corporations, insurance companies, hospitals, and doctors. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it all comes down to politics, and back then, you had a very strong medical lobby in Lansing. We had a
Yeah.
Republican governor.
Yes.
We had a Republican Congress.
Yes.
We had a Republican Supreme Court, primarily made of Republicans, and they being the medical lobby and the insurance industry, got a piece of legislation that they crafted, passed through our legislation that's been in effect now for 26, 27 years.
They
You know,
even they even made it that it's almost impossible to sue hospitals and doctors by making the statute of limitation 2 years. And we've talked in the past about how short of a period that is, because by the time you gather the medical records and you go to a lawyer to see whether there was negligence in this case, months will have passed by because the lawyer needs to review, and before the lawyer incurs high cost of sending the file to doctors for their review. Those doctors charge $500, $700 an hour for the review. The lawyer has to feel reasonably certain that this is a case likely to succeed. So that takes time for the lawyer to gather the medical records, and it takes time for the lawyer to review it and feel reasonably certain that there is something there, to identify an expert, to send the records to the expert, to have the expert review the records, the expert call back. That sometimes takes 6 to 9 months. And the first lawyer may turn down the case, and that will leave very little time for the victim or the family of the victim of medical malpractice to do this again. This time, maybe they have the medical records, but the new lawyer needs to look at the records, satisfy herself or himself that there is something there before they incur the cost of sending it out to doctors to review. So the 2 year period, there is a 6 month discovery period we're not talking about right now, but the 2 year period sounds like a long time, but it really isn't.
yeah. So the moral to what you just said is that, you know, you shouldn't wait on these cases. Um, and for a lot of reasons. One is because you only have 2 years and it goes by fast. But the other reason I always tell clients is that, when you talk to a lawyer early on, the information that is in your mind is freshest, and so the longer you wait, the more your memory will fade and evidence will get lost. So, if something goes wrong and you're questioning it and you're trying to figure out whether the doctor has made a mistake, call your favorite lawyer and get it done.
Yeah, I remember in law school that always tell us memories fade and witnesses die or relocate. The witness, the doctors, they can be the nurses.
That is
Life,
true.
the more time you put. Now, since we're talking and we only have 7 minutes remaining, so let's just talk about a couple of things rather than approach something pretty big because of the time. The We said that the by the way, the 2 year statute of limitation is even shorter than what the law gives you to sue another driver who caused you an accident. There you have 3 years, but to sue for your medical mistakes you only have 2 years. What about when it is a child under the age of 18? What
Mhm.
about when the victim of the medical mistake is a child under age 18? How much time does that child have? 2 years as well?
No.
No.
So, and they've changed this over the years as well. It used to be that a minor who was a victim of malpractice had until their 18th birthday, and they changed that
Right.
number of years ago to 15. And today, a minor has until their 10th birthday in which to bring a claim.
Okay, let's repeat that. It used to be that a minor had until age 18.
Correct.
Then they made it harder and it became a minor has until age 15.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's even more hard. A minor only has until age 10. So if a minor is the victim of malpractice at age 9, he only has 1 year to sue?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So what you have really, it depends on when the malpractice occurred. Okay, so let's just say this malpractice for that 9-year-old of yours occurred when he was born, right?
Yeah.
He has one more year. Okay,
Okay.
he has until his 10th birthday. But if the malpractice occurred at the age of 9,
He has
then he
until
has until he's 11. He's got 2 years.
okay. It's okay. I
Yeah,
understand.
you don't get cut off the older you get. They don't cut you off. If the malpractice occurred at 11, I'm sorry, 9 years and 11 months, you still get 2 more years.
Okay, I understand. But the child being at most 10 years of age will not be able to testify. It,
Well, that's another issue. I mean, the fact is that they really have made it much more difficult for us to be able to bring these minor cases. I mean, you definitely want to be able to put a child on the stand and testify, and if you got to bring the case before they're 10, then it's hard to. Well, you can get some information out of a child, but to really try to understand the child's injuries, that's going to have to come from his or her doctors. You know.
and the parents as
And the
well.
family, correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
We have 4 minutes remaining. Let me ask you a quick question. Are you still getting a lot of calls about COVID related deaths and such?
They're winding down, but they do trickle in from time to time. So yes, sort of, yeah. And again,
Do you handle those? What is a typical call and
I
what's a
mean,
typical answer?
it's usually, I had my mother. I had to take my
You know,
mother to the hospital, and she did not have COVID, but she contracted COVID at the hospital. They ran the test on her. It was negative. They discharged her. She gets home, and her health goes south. She can't breathe, and then she dies. And then we find out later that she has COVID. Well, you know, so we can't. Two problems with that. One is there are a lot of false negatives and false positives with these COVID tests. So it's hard to say that somebody screwed up. And number two, because it's a pandemic, because it's affecting everybody, we as a firm have basically come down with a position that it would be difficult to convince a jury or a jury pool that a doctor or a medical professional has made a mistake related to COVID. It's a very tough sell to a jury.
Um, are you familiar with the term, I'm sure you are, hospital acquired infections?
Sure.
So
Yes.
it's almost like now, if you go to a hospital, you may catch COVID and it's like a known hospital acquired infection. And I'm speaking loosely here, but it kind of sounds the same way. In
Mm-hmm.
addition to the difficulty of proving was that a real positive, real negative. But what if you go to a hospital and you catch it at the
Mm-hmm.
hospital? Can you sue the hospital for that?
That's precisely what they wanted to do. The answer is, I mean, can you do it? You could always do it as long as you can find an expert that will support it. But we find it very difficult